So, welcome to another episode of On Air with Phoenician Hunter and 369 Lumineer. This is podcast number 19, which is titled Atlantis Reimagined, the Phoenician Connection. And it's part two of this discussion, which follows on from last week's podcast. Welcome again, Phoenician Hunter.
Hello, it's good to be back.
It's good to be here. Look, let's dive straight in. So in last week's discussion, you were building the case for the similarities between the Phoenicians or the Carthaginians and the Atlanteans. Can you tell us more about that?
We mentioned in part one how, we have been inundated with countless retellings of, the theories of Atlantis. And most of these I found that they lose sight of the, Plato's original setting. So, it was important for me to try and stay within Plato's era. So the time period of when this was actually written, which we said was 360 BC, because that gives us the clues, tell us what was actually happening at that time. So, and because it's the Greeks who give us this story in the first place, that's where we need to pay our attention to the Greeks and their world. We'll just get into the article. The experts tell us that, Greek mythology was largely influenced by the Canaanite religion of the Phoenicians. For instance, the Greek gods Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades mirror those of the Canaanite gods, which are Baal, Yan, and Mot. And also, this is the same with the story of the labors of Hercules, which mirrors their hero, which was the Tyrian Melkart. What you find with these old Greek stories and the gods, they're adaptations of the Canaanite religion.
Okay, so I get where you're making the connection with the adaptations, but in your article there's a section where you write, the god Poseidon rules over the sea, the storms, earthquakes, horses, and was the protector of seafarers. And according to Plato, Atlantis was Poseidon's domain, and his firstborn, Atlas, became its first ruler. Can you elaborate?
Yes. So according to Plato, he's telling us there that Atlas was the first king of Atlantis, and Poseidon's other son, so that was one of his sons, his other son, Aegina, is said to have become the king of Phoenicia. So, there's your connection with Phoenicia and Atlantis. Okay. So one son becomes the king of Atlantis and the other son becomes the king of Phoenicia. Okay. And then continuing on from that myth, we hear that Aegina had several children, including sons Cadmus, Phoenix, and a daughter named Europa, and this is where we get the name for the continent of Europa from. And Cadmus was said to have introduced the Phoenician alphabet to the Greeks. Okay, so that's important. So I'm just trying to make the connection between the Phoenicians and the Greeks. So the Greeks were heavily influenced by the Phoenicians, and the Phoenicians are connected to the Atlanteans as well through these myths. Okay. So, to summarize, you have the Greek god Poseidon ruling over Atlantis, or the Greek or the Phoenician god, right, ruling over Atlantis, and his first son is the king of Atlantis, and his other son is the king of Phoenicia. And what's important here is that these stories that the Greeks have adopted were imparted to them by the Phoenicians.
Right.
So it's the Phoenicians who are telling them this story about the myths of Atlantis and the gods and the kings.
Okay. So now that we've established the connection between the Greeks and the Phoenicians based on Plato's writings, and obviously you've gone through and evaluated that, I'd like your thoughts on another part of his writings where he describes the capital of Atlantis featuring concentric rings, and you make specific mention to these in your article. Why?
Yeah, okay. This is a feature that a lot of researchers gravitate to, and they sort of find features around the world that may resemble these rings. And I think they found one recently in North Africa, which made the headlines not long ago, and it had these sort of rings, and they say, okay, that's Atlantis. Wherever people find, this pattern around the world, that they assume that that's the remnants of Atlantis, right? But what I found was that a number of older researchers had linked these rings, which Plato mentions, with similar ancient features found in Carthage. So they were also found in Carthage before they were found in, like I said, more recently in North Africa. And there was another one that came up recently as well, which was found in Spain near the port city of Cadiz, I think it's called. So going back to the article, and then another claim that I found from older researchers was that Carthage may have been built, this is what they say, Carthage may have been built on the remains of an earlier city that had been Atlantis or one of her colonies. So that's important we'll discuss that later, or one of her colonies. So again, with all my research, I tend to go back to older sources. So these researchers and these sources are around the 1800s, and that's where they were looking at the time. In ancient times, going back to this concentric rings, right? In ancient times, the harbour in Carthage was known as the Cothon. So that's spelled Cothon. And this is a man-made circular harbour, and these constructions were very unique to Phoenician ports. Okay, so they were Phoenician architecture. They were the only ones who were using this feature. And I placed some images in the article, so you really need to look at those images to appreciate the likeness between the two. This Phoenician harbour, which they call a Cothon, and this concentric circles rings that Plato mentions in his book as well.
Yeah, well, look, it's funny you should say that because your article prompted me to do a little bit of research, extra research over and above, because that's what you do. You create this discourse for people to search for more. And what I discovered, as you've just said, that the layout was like of this central city. You mentioned the Cothon. What Plato writes, he talks about these concentric rings of land and water. And I've seen, you just Google Atlantis, and this is exactly what.
That's what always comes up, doesn't it?
That's whenever you do it. All these concentric rings. So what I saw, if I can just quickly explain, are 3 rings of water separated by 2 rings of land, which forms kind of this elaborate circular canal system, right? And in my opinion, it's not just visually stunning, because I'm always zooming in and looking at these a lot closer. It just looks incredibly advanced for the time it was supposedly built. So in your article, you write that the Cothon at Carthage was divided into a rectangular merchant harbour, which was followed by an inner protected harbour reserved for military use only. And this inner harbour was circular and surrounded by an outer ring of structures, as I've just explained. Yeah. And it was divided into a series of docking bays for ship maintenance, along with an island structure at its centre that also housed Navy ships, which to me was fascinating after I read that, which prompted me to research more. So can you maybe focus on that for a moment?
Yeah, and also we need to point out that when reports of this feature were coming through, so when people were trying to describe it, they probably were describing it after it had been destroyed. So if you're looking at something that's obviously destroyed or the remains of something, you're never going to get a clear understanding or reading of what it would look like when it was finished. Yeah. So just keep that in mind, and that's why a lot of people find these rings, like I said earlier, around the world and say, oh, that looks like the remains of what Plato described. And there was another one also that I came across that was in South America as well. I mean, right. I think it was Peru at one point or something like that, where the civilizations there had some kind of irrigation system that was similar, circular, and people said, oh, that must be the remains of. So this comes up again and again and again. But like I said, no recent authors or researchers were saying anything about this likeness to this structure that the Phoenicians had built, except, like I said, older researchers. It seems like the newer researchers have sort of moved away. They've moved too far away from Plato's writings and the old research and just gone, I don't know, supernatural, alien.
You start to question, with the geographic distance between these structures, it doesn't come down just to coincidence. It doesn't just come down to, they just happen to build these structures that look the same. Right?
Exactly. And what are we talking about here? We're still talking about the Western naval empire that ruled the Western world, like we mentioned in the last podcast. So all these pieces individually probably don't mean anything, but when you bring them all together, the pieces sort of fit. Okay, so the rings, they had the rings as well. Oh, they've got the naval empire as well. Oh, they're a commercial people as well. So, all these things add up, the stories and the myths of Atlantis are told by the Phoenicians. And, so you got to look at the whole picture.
Sure.
So I was just wondering if this unusual construction maybe was the inspiration for what Plato's capital of Atlantis was. So, right. He was probably, like we mentioned in the last podcast, this was written around the times that Greece and Carthage were at war. So, was he getting reports from Greek sailors coming back from Carthage and saying, oh, we've witnessed this. These sailors were giving the description to the Greeks of what they
Sure.
saw, and it was
Yeah.
like concentric rings, and and then Plato or other writers use their imagination and come up with that description that we're all familiar with. Yeah, so going back to the article, I'm not the first to advocate this relationship between the Phoenicians and Atlantis. There was an author, again in the 1800s, Ignatius Donnelly, who wrote a very famous book on Atlantis. It's called The Antediluvian World. And he believed that the Phoenicians were, in fact, the descendants of the Atlanteans, or, the remnants of the survivors of the Atlanteans after the destruction.
Okay. Well, you do quote Ignatius Donnelly in your article. And just to expand on what you've said, he was a 19th century American politician and writer who, in my research, was essentially responsible for popularizing the modern legend of Atlantis.
Yeah, that's true. Exactly. Yep.
By claiming it was like a real advanced civilization that influenced ancient cultures worldwide. Nevertheless, in your article, you quote him and he writes, "The Atlanteans were, as Plato tells us, a maritime commercial people trading up the Mediterranean as far as Egypt and Syria and across the Atlantic to the whole opposite continent that surrounds the sea. The Phoenicians, as their successors and descendants, and colonized on the shores of the Mediterranean, inherited their civilization and their maritime habits." This is interesting for me. I'd like to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, and his entire book is interesting, and I highly recommend people who are interested in this topic to read that one. What he was trying to do, I believe, was trying to explain the likeness between ancient cultures that were found in America, especially down South America, and those of the ancient world. And his theory was that there was this one older civilization that linked the two. So yeah, fascinating book.
Yeah.
So, yeah, according to Donnelly, the Phoenicians were, as you say, the surviving remnant of Atlantis. And after its destruction, they are the ones that spread this, knowledge of civilization to the rest of mankind that at that time were, probably primitive. So they brought civilization, or, planted what we call the seed of civilization. And by the way, a maritime people would be the best to achieve this task, because they've got the skills of sailing and the means. They've got, the ships, and they can travel great distances, and their trading ways is important with making contact with other cultures. And they don't come as conquerors. They don't come as threatening. So people would be more open to, accepting them. So, maritime people would be the ideal people to do this, to seed civilization around the world, sharing resources, technologies, and language. And we said earlier, like the Phoenicians were the ones that brought the alphabet to the Greeks. So it makes sense. And touching on that, I've also just written an article covering the early Phoenician contact with Europe, or what people say is the colonization of Europe. And the article is called "The Colonization of Europe and the Seed of Western Civilization." So for those interested in wanting to know a little bit more about that and the origins of the European civilization and how it got kick-started, that article is up there ready for you to read.
And you can access that at phoenicianhunter.substack.com.
Yeah, so Donnelly found that through his research that there was definitely links between these ancient civilizations of America and those of Europe and Asia. So, for instance, in his book, he covers a lot of, of the construction methods that were used that were very similar. And, we find pyramid structures in South America as we do in, Egypt and elsewhere. The art was similar. Writing style, obviously they worship the sun, the celestial bodies. And an important one was the flood story as well. So how cultures from America had this history of a flood story, and this story is universal, and I believe it's very important, and even to the story of Atlantis, because I wonder if Atlantis is the central part of this flood story as well. So when they talk about the destruction of Atlantis, was the flood part of the reason it was destroyed, and then we get these stories all over the world again, because the Phoenicians are the ones who spread civilization around the world. So are they the ones that are spreading the story of the flood as well?
That's interesting. So what you're essentially saying is that Donnelly is suggesting that the Atlanteans were the first advanced civilization and the
Yep.
Phoenicians were the survivors of the catastrophe?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's pretty much what his conclusion. Yeah, in his book, Donnelly also reproduces a short tale, which which he found to be dated to around 300 AD. So an old story or poem. And part of it reads, "Upon the Syrian sea, the people live, who styled themselves Phoenicians. They were the great founders of the world." So just as many authors claim that the Atlanteans were the first civilization on Earth, the same is also attributed to the Phoenicians by many historians. They're always brought up as the ones that invented writing, the first to sail and all this. So there's a lot of firsts attributed to them,
Sure.
just as much as the Atlanteans. But like I said, the Atlanteans, we don't have actual proof that they existed. A lot of these.
There are no physical ancient texts that researchers like yourself can actually go to and get the actual truth.
Yeah, well, and a lot of scholars also, attribute it to being a myth and, just a fantasy. They're not really serious about it.
So there's also an interesting short legend or story, and this is a nice little segue into what you've just discussed, that you've written in your article about the connection with America and Atlantis. Can you maybe tell our listeners a little bit more about that?
I reproduced part of a legend that I found in an old book published in 1826, and it's quite long. But in short, it suggests that Atlantis had colonies in various parts of the world. Right?
Can I just ask you the name of the book?
It's called The Mythological Astronomy.
Great.
So it's not really related to the topic, but when I'm reading and researching other things, sometimes things pop up that I refer to for another article.
Sure.
So it had colonies in various parts of the world, and that Phoenicia was its eldest child, so its first colony. And after the loss of its mother country with the destruction of Atlantis, they could no longer trade with it, so they settled for commerce elsewhere, which would have been Europe, Asia, and North America. And in time, the knowledge of Atlantis and the knowledge of America was lost, and that's why we apparently didn't know about America's existence until the 15th century.
Right.
So I found that really interesting, that he's saying that Phoenicia wasn't Atlantis, but it was a colony of it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, look, there are a lot of people that may not be fully aware, and we mentioned this literally, 10 minutes ago, that we don't actually have access to ancient texts or original versions of any of Plato's own works, including the dialogues of Timaeus and Critias, which we discussed in last week's podcast.
Yeah, so that's another interesting point, that the oldest surviving manuscripts of his works are copies of copies, right? So they're copies from the medieval period. And the earliest Greek manuscript of Timaeus that we have is from the 9th century AD, so which is over 1,000 years from the writing of the original, okay? We've got to be mindful of that. And that's like me saying, hey, look, I've found this book published in 2020, really interesting, but it's a copy of a story that was written 1000 AD. The original is lost, but this is the real story here. 1,000 years after the event.
Right. Yeah.
We'll find with history it reoccurs over and over again that we don't have original copies of a lot of so-called ancient works. So we need to at least entertain the notion that what is passed off as ancient writings is actually, in fact, modern creations or recent creations. And this is something that Edwin Johnson, whose works I follow closely.
You mentioned him in last week's podcast.
Well, yeah, I mentioned him quite a lot. A lot of my posts are based off his works. And, he was one of the first to mention that a lot of ancient literature, he claims, apart from a few Latin works, were manufactured in the Middle Ages. So we're looking at around, the 13th, 14th centuries, which also, interestingly, going a bit off topic, marks the beginning of the Renaissance period, okay? So we look at that word Renaissance, is a French word, and it means rebirth. So rebirth, to be born again, a revival. So, I look at that period, and, I believe this is the period that they began to recreate Europe and the world in a new image, and most likely after some kind of catastrophe, which is not part of this post or this discussion, but, I might need to do a post on that at some point. But
Okay.
the Renaissance is, when all these texts start appearing about ancient Egypt and the ancient past, and they revive all these ancient Greek writings and manuscripts. And I'm wondering, like Edwin Johnson and some others are wondering, did they actually create them in that period and not revive them? You hear these stories and they just, we found this old manuscript in this monastery. We just found it, just lying there, and it's ancient. Just trust us, it's ancient.
So hang on, in your opinion, and I'd like to know this, based on the research that you've undertaken, is the Atlantean Empire actually Phoenician?
Although I believe that the Atlantis story is also part allegorical, we need to keep that in mind. There are many parallels that suggest that the Atlanteans were at least based to some degree on this Phoenician Carthaginian empire. And, I've laid out the evidence over two posts that Carthage may also have been just one of its colonies. So this empire, this extended Phoenician empire that, has come to be known as the Atlantean Empire, was probably Carthage was probably just one of its colonies, We've got to think of it like the British Empire. So if England or the British Isles disappeared overnight, they went to Australia and New Zealand and they saw, these people, they speak English and they have this certain culture and they have the building styles, the architecture, the skills, the art style of the English. People would think, okay, they're remnants of the English Empire, right? So it's the same kind of thing. So the Phoenicians are the remnants of this older civilization that has come to be known as the Atlantean Empire. That's the way I view it anyway.
Okay, well, that's a good explanation. So could I perhaps ask, could the Phoenicians therefore be related to the Atlanteans?
Well, we don't know that for certain, but there's two ways to look at it. They either related by blood. So if the Phoenicians were the Atlanteans, then yeah, they would be related. But then there's the other possibility that it was just, like I said earlier, it was just a colony. So then we look at that. If Atlantis is destroyed and then they migrate to Europe as the sole survivors and restart civilization, so basically from scratch, then their blood type will be related to the Atlanteans. But then if they are a colony and this colony had its own independent, ruling class, its own culture that was separate, like we mentioned in last week's podcast with the Persian Empire. Even when the Persian Empire ruled over the Phoenician cities, they really didn't have too much to do with their day-to-day activities. The Phoenicians pretty much ruled independently. They ran their own ship, basically. So what we need to keep in mind is if they were a colony, they wouldn't have been of the same bloodline. But this raises another point, that it was common practice in the ancient world for the nobility or the king or queen or prince of a nation to marry into the bloodlines of their conquerors or rivals, because this would create a partnership or an alliance. So one king would say, look, we're rivals or we rule over you, but if we marry, my son with your daughter, it will strengthen our alliance. So that thing could have happened. And that would be interesting, because then it raises another issue with the belief and custom of the divine right to rule that, has been, this ancient idea across all royalty in Europe and Asia, that they've got this divine right to rule. And I'm wondering, well, maybe that these Phoenician merchant families, this ruling class, married into this Atlantean royalty. And we need to keep in mind too, it doesn't mean that the people who are the sailors, who are the workers, and all these people are related. It only means that the ruling class are related, okay, by blood. And I'm wondering also if this extends to the merchant families that moved after Phoenicia and moved to Venice and Genoa and these other maritime empires. I wonder if those merchant families have that DNA strain within them as well.
Well, it makes perfect sense, because if anyone that's just done surface level research on nobility and bloodlines, you tend to read a common theme, and that common theme is that they tend to keep them within their bloodlines. They tend to keep it within the family for generations.
Yeah, and also I had a question the other day by a subscriber, and they said, "Oh yeah, but when I look at the Phoenicians, they don't look like the elite class. They're not blonde hair, blue eyed, and they look almost Semitic, right?"
Mm.
So now that could be true, but that's like I was saying, it doesn't mean that the general public have this bloodline that is connected to the royalty. Maybe they just kept it within a few families, like you said, and then that gives them that divine right to rule because they have that connection, they have that DNA.
Well,
It doesn't extend to the people,
well, that's right. You said in British royalty or the British monarchy, for example, it goes back generations and it's all kept within the same bloodline.
Exactly.
Cousins
Yeah.
marrying cousins and so forth. So
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's only probably in recent years that the royal class has sort of started marrying outside of royalty.
yeah,
So historically, that wouldn't have been done.
that's right.
Yeah.
So, okay. Well, for our listeners, maybe in one sentence or a statement, perhaps summarize your article.
We need to remember also, as so much of Phoenician history is a modern construct, like we mentioned in the last podcast, we probably will never really fully discover the origins and customs and deeds of these people. So therefore, we're left with this kind of tradition that I keep finding, and it keeps coming up in various books and articles, that this tradition that assigns the Phoenicians, just like the Atlanteans, so they have this same tradition attached to them, that they are the first great founders of the world. They are the bringers of civilization. They're the ones that bring it and spread it around the world, be it technology, be it language, be it religion. They're the ones, they're assigned to both the Atlanteans and the Phoenicians. So to my reading, they're not separate. They're the one entity, the one empire. One could have just been a colony of the other, but they're still connected. It's my conclusion.
And that makes perfect sense. But what it also does is it dispels the theory or the myth that the ancient Greeks, for example, created all this, the alphabets, the sciences, the medicines, and all that sort of stuff, when we actually know, based on your research, that it goes way back to the Phoenicians, and the Phoenicians literally passed the torch onto the Greeks.
Yes, exactly. And, people might say, oh, but, there were older cultures than the Phoenicians, and then they'll point to Mesopotamia and Sumeria. That brings up another point, and I've touched on that in another article, and it's called The Noble Ones, that there is a connection between the Phoenicians and the Sumerians as well. And there are some researchers that see them as the same entity as well. Okay, so the Phoenicians were sort of almost like the navy of the Sumerians, all right, or the traders for them. So there is a connection there.
Well, that's I've got to say that's really fascinating for me. I've loved this chat. I've loved part one of this chat last week. Thanks again for your time and your insights and your knowledge, and appreciate the amount of research that you do. And for our listeners, they can go to phoenicianhunter.substack.com to read all your amazing articles. I encourage people to actually take out a paid subscription, because you'll be amazed at the sort of stuff that you can read historically. You can also go to our YouTube channel, which is at On Air Podcasts 2025, all hyphenated. But just before we go, any closing comments for our listeners?
I have a few things. First of all, thanks for the kind words.
Always.
I've been inundated with a lot of comments, and I've mentioned before that this isn't a full-time thing for me. Hopefully that's what will transpire, that's what I'm aiming for. But at the moment, so I'm trying to juggle a lot of things. So I get a lot of comments, and I can't always get back to people as quickly as I would like. So, I apologize for that. And
I think based on, if I can just interject there, based on how long it takes you to do just the one article, how long it takes you to, say, prepare and discuss for these podcasts, I think that's understandable that people will expect you to take a little while to respond.
I think they do. Everyone's very courteous. Well, people who follow me are anyway. Yeah, I just wanted to mention that I always do. I believe I do get back to everyone eventually, just that it might just take a little time, that's all. And yeah, that's all I want to say there. And again, thank you for everyone's support.
Well, like I said, it's been an amazing journey for us, for me and you on these podcasts. You know, looking back at our first podcast to now we're on number 19, which has been a phenomenal journey. Look, all I can say about today's discussion is that Atlantis will always be this enigma that still sparks fascination and fuels people's imaginations. And whether it's an allegory, factual, or a mix of both, as you've just taken us through, or if it's a lost civilization or a race of superhumans with advanced tech, the story will always have various and countless interpretations. So thanks again for joining us on this final part of our Atlantis journey.
Thank you, and we'll get together next week for another one.
Absolutely. Looking forward to that. And remember to subscribe to both Phoenician Hunter's Substack channel, as I've said, phoenicianhunter.substack.com, and our YouTube channel at On Air Podcasts 2025, all hyphenated, to listen to every podcast we've produced. And of course, our YouTube podcasts are free to listen to. So until next time, stay well.